Like any other object in the editor, we have the ability to adjust the properties of the bike and the rider. When building tracks, the bike and rider will always appear next to the last checkpoint you had selected. If you can't find the rider, just select the nearest checkpoint and the rider should appear right there. Let's start with the rider. Select the rider and hit the up arrow on the D-pad to bring up the rider's properties. The first two options should look familiar by now, so let's skip to Advanced Physics. The Advanced Physics option looks a little different than the ones we covered in the Object Properties menu, mainly by the way you adjust the values. They do the same thing as their counterparts in Object Properties, just using percentages. Our next option, Dead Zones Enabled, would be used if you were using dead zones on a gamepad. Next we have Use Secondary Camera. Select this option if you want to use the replay camera or the red camera. Our next parameter is Frozen. This does exactly what you think it would. Freezes the rider, basically removing all physics properties. Generally, for tracks that use the bike and rider, you want this box unchecked. But later, when we get into triggers, events, and data sources, I'll show you how this can be turned on and off during gameplay. And that brings us to our next option. Unfrozen Type determines how the rider will react when Frozen is toggled from on to off. With the default setting, when Frozen is deactivated, the rider will just have physics return. If he is in the air, he will just fall to the ground. When set to Keep Motion, the game will remember the motion the rider had before he was frozen. So, if the rider was jumping and frozen in mid-air, the rider will continue the speed and motion of the jump after being unfrozen. Invulnerability should be fairly self-explanatory also. This option will make the rider invulnerable to damage. Things like force from explosions or a smack upside the head won't even faze him. Below that is Endurance. You can adjust how tough the rider is here. A value of 100 is default. Turn it down to 0 and the slightest bump will put the rider on the ground. Turn it up to 1000 and the rider will take a serious beating, but eventually fall once he takes enough hits. The next two options should also be self-explanatory. Deselect Sounds Enabled if you want all the rider sounds to be silenced. Uncheck Vibration Enabled and the rider will not trigger the controller vibrations. Finally, we have Bailout Force. This is the force applied when the rider bails out from the bike. 100% is default. Bring it down to 0 and the rider will pretty much just let go of the bike. Crank it up and the rider will launch off the bike when you bail out. Next, let's check out bike properties. Most of these are the same as the rider properties, except for these items at the bottom of the menu. First, we'll check out engine and braking. In this sub-menu, you can adjust the power of your bike's engine and brakes. These adjustments will be applied to whatever bike the player chooses, so 100% will always be the default setting for that particular bike. So, if you set the bike's power to 150%, each bike will be that much more powerful. But since it's based on each bike's default, the Rhino will still be more powerful than the Mantis. The next three settings are Headlight Color, Intensity, and Casts Shadows. You can use these properties to adjust the color of the bike's headlamp, how bright it is, and if it casts a shadow. Keep in mind that the headlamp is a dynamic light. If you are having trouble with your track's performance, you can turn off casting shadows. And if your track is fairly bright, you can turn down the intensity and this could help.